Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and today we're going to talk about how to make the Guardians of the Galaxy characters great because of the upcoming Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 movie in May. However, guys, before we get into that, I just want to thank all of the absolutely great fans, super supportive, who have been messaging me and tweeting me, or whatever the hell that is, as a result of me missing an upload and being inconsistent recently with the live streaming. I know it's a bit of a shock to you guys, or it's kind of disappointing, and I'm sorry. I will try to get things fixed and get back to the regularly scheduled uploading and live streaming time, but I just wanted to thank you guys for your support and for the love that you're sending through the airwaves, because I'm receiving it and I'm really appreciative of it. So let's jump into it, guys. The Guardians of the Galaxy are getting their second movie. Everybody is really hyped for it. So I thought now would be the perfect time to talk about what some of the changes that Netmarble could make are to the Guardians of the Galaxy characters to make them even better than they are now. Keep in mind that not all of the Guardians actually need changes. Some of them I think are good as is, but we will talk about each one and discuss where they could make changes, where they could make each of these characters better, if they did want to do that to coincide with the new movie. So I will say that right off the bat, Yondu doesn't need any changes. I think the character is in a fantastic place. Netmarble has placed him at an appropriate power level. He's good. As far as Groot goes, I think that there are some changes Netmarble could do. If you guys are not familiar with the Make Them Great series, we basically talk about each character, what the character does well, and then what the character could do even better if Netmarble were to make some changes. I try to include both practical changes that I would expect them to do given their game design and the philosophy that they're currently following, and I also try to give some more creative out-of-the-box ideas in case they get frisky with it and want to kind of hit me up on the dev phone that I obviously have access to get some extra motivation for these skill changes. So Groot is the first one on the chopping block, and I don't think he actually needs much wood taken off the tip. I think he's a very good character already, and he has kind of that support character healer on lock. Even though the Ancient One's heal is larger, and even though the Ancient One's heal lasts longer and has a shorter cooldown, Groot does have that very handy tier 2 passive where he applies a passive chance to proc a heal for all of the allies, and that's a very unique tier 2 passive. So I think Groot already does very well in that category. I just think he needs a little bit of a bump to reinsert himself. He's kind of starting to lose favor in PvP modes, and he's not really a standalone character to solo any kind of content right now. So I think a couple of things that Netmarble could do to make Groot more relevant for the movie, aside from giving him the baby Groot uniform, because that would just be the cutest thing ever, would be, for example, to give him a damage buff. Now I know that sounds a little bit weird given that I have said that he's a healing character and he is a support character, but if they just bump his damage stats and the numbers by a little bit, they could make tier 2 Groot actually meaningful in things like Shadowlands, whereas right now, even at tier 2, he can't even clear a Shadowlands level competently. Once you get into the mid-teens, he starts to struggle with his damage versus the 3-minute timer. So that would be one effect it could give him. If they wanted to keep him very defensive and keep him on the support end of things, they could tie his leadership to his tier 2 passive. So if you don't know, his leadership offers 45% physical defense, but it only applies to the type that he shares with his teammates. So in this case, it's all combat types. When I go and I equip his Secret Wars Thor uniform, which is quite good, his type changes to universal, and now his leadership changes to universal types, getting that universal bonus. So they could work something similar into his tier 2 passive, where just all allies, they don't necessarily need to be combat or universal, get, let's say, 10% all defense or 20% physical defense, and that wouldn't be game breaking or game changing, but it would help him a little bit and make him catch up to some of the other support tier 2s, because now that we've seen the likes of Warwolf and Phil Coulson, this kind of pales in comparison. So those are my thoughts for Groot, but the character's in a pretty good spot right now as it is. He doesn't necessarily need a change. Similarly, guys, I don't think StarLord needs a change, but he could use some minor bumps, some minor nudges in the right direction to get him to be more than just a leadership hog. Because right now, I think that that's what StarLord is known for, a good leadership. But with characters like Hela, Ironheart, and Ancient One basically doing what he does better than he does it, he's really fallen into the shadows. And I think such a awesome character, such a colorful character, should really not be relegated to the shadows. I mean, they did improve his wingman tier 2 skill, they did improve his uniform passive, they did improve a lot of different aspects of the character, and I think they could just go a step further and really make StarLord shine on his own, because I think that's where he struggles. So one thing I think that Netmarble could do is give Gravity Grenade and a CC effect, like a 3-second stun, or a bind and a snare, or a pulling effect, because as you guys can see from the trailer, Rocket Raccoon uses the Gravity Grenade in the forest scene to great effect. So if it would throw up the enemies in the air and give us a really cool animation, give us some CC, it would make StarLord a lot more viable in things like Shadowland. As well, I think they could permanently give I Have a Plan an iframe. It's technically not an iframe, so he can get hit. And if they just tweak that around, kind of stealth buffed him, that would be really nice. If they made Power of the Orb as well hit more targets, be more of an AoE attack, it would really go a long way to making StarLord a viable character. But you could argue that he's okay now, even with his hilarious, Tour de France armor. The last character on the Guardians of the Galaxy that you don't necessarily think of when you think of buffs and when you think of tweaks is Nebula. And although she's not a Guardian, she's kind of the bad guy, Nebula is very important in Future Fight right now, and I think that Netmarble could show a lot of love strategically to the free-to-play or the low VIP audience by giving Nebula a bit of a bump to coincide with this movie. The reason why Nebula is seen kind of as the olive branch to the free-to-play players is because she's probably the best combat supervillain we have right now, and she's the only one that you can really reasonably farm for outside of Carnage. So she's basically the best free-to-play version of Carnage if you don't have a bio subscription that you get by paying money. So because of that, I would see her, or I'd argue that she is the olive branch to the free-to-play portion of the game, and if they gave her a buff, it would go a long way to improving those players' scores in Extreme Alliance Battle, which they use Nebula for. Now, her tier 2 passive is already very strong. Her leadership is kind of garbage, so they could absolutely change that to a meaningful leadership. I mean, 60% lightning damage is reasonable. It's not, it's not a shot in the dark. They could also make Shooting Star, which is her go-to 5th skill, be a larger AoE attack. And I liken it, or I want to liken it to something like Black Widow's 5th skill with all that lightning damage and all that, AoE mob crushing potential. Another thing they could do for Gamora, which kind of echoes her character in the comics, is give her some invisibility, either on her Stunning Grace passive, because right now it's terrible, or on her 4th skill Dagger Dance, because she does have the ability to change her appearance in the comics to kind of almost shapeshift or create an illusion that makes her look like another person, and they could illustrate or thematically represent that with invisibility, and it would add to the character's survivability, with which right now she only has on Shooting Star. So that would be really great, and that would go a long way to making people happy who have invested in Nebula, gotten her tier 2, and gotten that silly looking uniform. I mean, I know it's iconic, but it looks weird. The last 3 characters on this list, obviously the ones you see before you, Drax, Gamora, and Rocket Raccoon, are probably arguably the 3 worst characters in their respective types: combat, blast, and speed. There's just not a lot going for these characters, and they're very understated and underwhelming for how cool they're supposed to be. All 3 of these characters are super cool, and they just don't come through in the game right now, and they're so iconic because they've been in the game for so long. I'm not talking about you this time, Ronan. So let's start off with Drax. Drax is supposed to be the Thanos Destroyer, guys. Drax the Destroyer. That Destroyer stands for Thanos, guys. In the comics, certain iterations of Drax can actually sense where Thanos is in the universe and like search him out, like a dog sniffing device specifically for Thanos bombs. It's what the character was made for. So with that in mind, guys, I think that it's only appropriate to give Drax something like what Squirrel Girl has. So if you're not familiar, guys, Cosmic Defender, she has a passive 25% increased damage dealt against universal type characters. So Netmarble could take that 4-star passive, reapply it to Drax, because his 4-star passive is fucking terrible, and they could make it a lot better and more thematic for him. So instead of 25%, they could make it 30 or 40% increased damage to universal villains. So that would exclude all of the heroes, Thor, Medusa, Black Bolt, all of the good guys, and it would just target the likes of the Black Order and Thanos, and it would make Drax a bit of a cheeky play in PvP modes for free to play against kind of the whale generation, who has all of those, you know, powerful universal supervillains built up. This could be a counter for them, the Dormammus especially. So I would love to see Netmarble do something like that. I really think that it would fit the character perfectly as far as the theme of him goes, and it would just make him very fun to play in things like Timeline and Battle World. I think they also need to change his tier 2 passive, because right now it triggers off of a skill, Cry for Blood, which basically doesn't do that much. I know it buffs him and it debuffs the opponent, but it doesn't do any damage, or it doesn't do enough damage, and it just kind of like, I'm casting this because I have to be immune, but not because I want to. And you really don't want mechanics that players have to do but don't want to do, so they feel this conflicted thing. They'd rather just not play with the character at all if it's going to be like that. So I think that Netmarble should at least either make Cry for Blood deal damage, give it a larger buff and debuff, or change it so that it triggers on a different skill. But on top of that, I do think that Netmarble needs to make at least one of Drax's skills an iframe, especially if he's jumping around a lot, or they need to just build a, you know, permanent immune on one of his skills to give him that extra bump of survivability. If they're not going to change his leadership, if they're not going to give him more damage, they at least need to make him more tanky. So he can deal more damage to Thanos and his cronies, and he can be super tanky. He could be kind of a difficult world boss clear the way that Ant-Man is, and the way that he takes a long time and he kind of chips you down bit by bit, but he's super tanky with all that guaranteed dodge. They could do that for Drax. Or they could bump up his damage a lot and keep the tier 2 passive as is, but change around his 4-star for that universal villain thematic, you know, damage. But I think something needs to be done for our boy Drax. Maybe even give him the Infinity Watch uniform, guys. If you're not familiar with what that is, he's got kind of a cloak and a cape. He can fly. They could change his typing to Universal or Blast. It would be very cool. It would fit maybe with future characters like Adam Warlock, which is very exciting, and it would look cool. Next up, we have Gamora, and Gamora is another character that I feel should be stronger. She should be cooler, more badass, and she's just not. So similar to Nebula, her kind of counterpart, I think that Netmarble needs to make at least one of Gamora's skills, preferably her 4th or 5th, because those are long, beautiful animations, a full iframe. That will give Gamora the survivability that she desperately needs, and it will also give her a go-to for when the damage is coming in hot and heavy and she has to do one of her attacks. Because right now, it's very fun to watch Gamora attacking, but it's also basically pointless. Even at tier 2, 35% guaranteed dodge is not enough. She's gonna get hit, and she can't take more than 3 or 4 hits from powerful enemies, so she's gonna die in, you know, 8 or 10 hits with evasions included. It's just not good enough. She needs iframes, or she needs invulnerability, so they need to build that into some of her skills. To make her more interesting and make her just another cookie cutter invulnerability character, they should also try to build something more creative around the bleed component or game mechanic that they have in the game. They have her as a bleed character similar to Black Panther and others, and they're just not doing enough with it. So many of Gamora's skills have multi-hit animations, and it would be really cool to see something like bleed stacks be introduced to the game. So I have 2 different ways that they could introduce bleed stacks to make them interesting and fruitful. The first idea is to make it so that the more bleed stacks the enemy builds up, the more bleed damage they take. So 1 bleed stack, let's say, equals 40 damage per second for 5 seconds. But 10 bleed stacks is 400 damage per second for 5 seconds. You could scale the numbers up so they're actually meaningful, because 400 is not that much more, but it would be some way to get value out of the character, especially given that you're going to be watching through the full animation and not canceling it constantly. And it would be very cool in certain situations to see how high you could get those bleed stacks to go. Another thing they could do with the bleed stacks, and this is reminiscent of Dark Souls if you've played that game, is have it so the more bleed stacks that build up, once it gets to a specific amount, let's say 10 bleed stacks or 20 bleed stacks, then the enemy will automatically lose a certain percentage of their health pool. So let's say Gamora is fighting Infinity Thanos. This is an example, guys. And she has to stack 20 bleed counters. After she stacks those 20 bleed hits, then Thanos will lose 10% of his HP. 10% of Infinity Thanos' 3.6 million HP is 360,000. That's a pretty sizable number. And that would make the character fun to play, but it would also reward mechanically solid gameplay, skill canceling, kiting, using the right moves at the right time given what Infinity Thanos is doing, and it would make Gamora fun to play the way that Gwenpool is to play, and I really want to see Netmarble do something like that for her. The last character on this list that needs the most help, and that's why I left him for the end, is our boy Rocket Raccoon. The problem with him, despite the fact that his skills are so cool and so creative and made with a lot of good intentions, is that they just don't pan out well, and they just don't have enough of an impact in the game. So we have to change the core mechanics of his skills in order for the character to have more of a punch. So I think it needs to start with the trap mine, because that's probably his most unique skill. I think the trap mine needs to lay the traps further apart, not only further from Rocket Raccoon, but also further apart from each other, and each individual mine, if it's not too difficult to code, should have its own proximity or its own radius for it to be triggered. So it's not just that the enemy has to walk directly over it, because that's just too painful. Also, guys, it's really silly that iframes get rid of the mines. I know it's handy in Shadowlands when you're fighting Rocket Raccoon, but it's really annoying when an enemy does an iframe or in PvP and your mines just automatically disappear from the ground. I don't know if it's some kind of visual error or graphical bug given the way that iframes interact with other skills, but if Netmarble could fix that, it would be really great, because otherwise this skill is always going to have a cheesy way of avoiding it. I also think that they could make the trip mines more powerful by adding a movement speed debuff. That way it would punish you and encourage actually, or it would kind of snowball the effect of running into more mines, because you can't really control your character as much when their movement speed has dropped, and you might unintentionally or accidentally run into more mines on your way to Rocket Raccoon to try to kill his furball ass. So that would be really nice as well. Another thing they could do if they give him a new uniform for the movie is make the trip mine turn into an aerial bomb strike as a skill change, the way that StarLord's lasers come out from the sky when he calls them Milano, or Yondu's 5th skill also calls lasers. They could do that for Rocket Raccoon's 3rd skill. Speaking of Groot, I also think that they need to change the 5th skill. It's good because it heals, but it's bad because it roots Rocket Raccoon. It doesn't heal for enough, and it doesn't deal any kind of significant damage. So I think they need to make this a full invulnerability skill. That way Rocket Raccoon can safely heal up with Groot's help, and he can continue to fight. The last thing I think that they could do for Rocket Raccoon to keep the essence of the character but really make him more powerful is change his reload passive, which I love, guys. This is one of the most creative passives in the game, but it only applies to one of his skills, so it kind of feels bad that you have to continuously cast covering fire to try to get that value back from the reload 4-star passive. So I would love it if they changed this reload passive to apply to all of Rocket Raccoon's skills. So 25% chance when he is using any skill, it resets the cooldown on that skill. So that would be really fun, and it would still encourage you to cycle through all of Rocket Raccoon's skills, but then if you got really lucky, you could cast Ion Cannon multiple times. You could continuously cast I've Got a Plan and get that invulnerability rolling to chain a bunch of heals, and it would make for some really cool moments where you said, hey, you know, I went to kill Thanos with my tier 2 Rocket Raccoon, and Ion Cannon kept going on cooldown when I used it, so I just insta-killed Infinity Thanos by casting Ion Cannon over and over and over again, and I finished the fight in like a minute. That would be really awesome, and that would keep the character's, you know, core design mechanics the way the Netmarble devs did it intact. So those are my thoughts for the Guardians of the Galaxy, guys. Those are the changes that I think need to be made to these characters, especially for Drax, Gamora, and Rocket. These three are hurting the most, guys. So I'm really curious what you have to think and what you have to say about this. Which of the Guardians of the Galaxy do you think needs the most help, and which one have you invested the most in? And of course, guys, if you like what you see, I hope to see you again tomorrow. Take care.